gentlemen. Um, it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today on the Renewable Energy Program that the South African government through the Department of Energy launched about 4 years ago, and to share with you some insight on the success story that it has become for IPPs on the African continent. So I will begin with a bit of a background, just sort of setting the scene in terms of the power sector, and then we will get into the more specific nuances regarding the renewable energy. So essentially, South Africa has about 95% of its generation capacity from coal. For a very small population of about 55 million people, South Africa is essentially in the top 15 worst polluters in terms of contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And as such, following on from that and, relating to the Kyoto Protocol and COP17, etc., the South African government sought to diversify its energy generation mix from coal to cleaner sources, including renewable energy, and making that a larger part of its generation mix going forward. So a total of 42% of South Africa's planned future generation mix is to be procured from renewable energy until the year 2030. And according to the government's energy plan, which is essentially called the Integrated Resources Plan, there's something like 8.4 gigawatts to be procured from wind over this period, 8.4 gigawatts to be procured from solar PV, and about 1 gigawatt from CSP. In 2011, the government released the Renewable Energy IPP Procurement Program, RFP, and this was South Africa's first major foray into IPPs being done in any large scale in South Africa. Prior to that, we had a few IPPs, but nothing of significance. But since 2011, South Africa has essentially, from zero renewables, we've essentially had about 92 IPPs, almost entirely from renewable energy, and some 60 of these have actually closed, have achieved financial close here in South Africa, and that is a total of about 6,327 megawatts across 5 bid windows. In terms of investment into the economy to date, there's been something like 193 billion rand, and depending on the exchange rate, it's somewhere in the region of 15.5, 16 billion US dollars. That in a period of 4 years. So before the RFP was actually released, the IPP office, which is a department under the auspices of the Department of Energy, spent a lot of time and money on various consultants, financial, legal, technical, and in so doing actually produced a set of documents or a suite of documents that was generally acceptable to the banking and the development community alike. Once released, there was no markup of documents that was actually permitted. So the standardized suite of documents that entailed the request for proposal, the RFP, entailed a standardized PPA for various technologies. So you had a standardized PPA for wind or solar PV or biomass or small hydro, etc. You had an implementation agreement, which was essentially the agreement where the South African government stood behind the obligations of the off-taker, which is Eskom, the connection agreement and direct agreement. So these are pretty standard, and in so doing, in having a standardized suite of documents, what entailed was that projects were able to be fast-tracked and get to financial close quickly without having to rehash the suite of documents on every single project. And that is actually testimony to the fact that we've had something like 92 IPPs in 4.5 years. The intention of the South African government is pretty much to replicate that process on renewable energy on the coal baseload program, the cogeneration program, and the imminent gas IPP program. And certainly, renewable energy has saved Eskom, the state utility, immensely on diesel bills and coal fuel costs. So under the program, you actually have Eskom, which is South Africa has a single buyer model, and Eskom, which is the utility, is the off-taker under the program. It is a 100% state-owned entity, and through the implementation agreement, as I've indicated, the Department of Energy has provided a form of credit enhancement to backstop the obligations, the offtake obligations, and the termination obligations of Eskom. So in the event of any default by Eskom, essentially the banking fraternity would be looking straight through the Department of Energy and ultimately the South African government. So if you go on to slide 3, you will actually find that on the bottom left corner is a map of South Africa, and just above that top left corner is an indication of the grid in South Africa, but also just to illustrate to you, what you've had in South Africa is essentially an aggregation of projects on wind across the coast. So you've had on the Eastern Cape and along the Western Cape, you've had, because of the windy conditions and that being along the coast, you've had an aggregation of wind projects. Whereas if you look at on the top left corner of the diagram on the upper left of the slide, on slide 3, you'll find the Northern Cape region, which is another state or another province in the country, and that has actually had some of the finest irradiation in sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of the solar projects, be it solar PV or concentrated solar projects, have actually been built in this vicinity. And what's actually resulted is that you've had, by virtue of the large number of projects in these respective regions for wind specifically and solar, you've had the grid coming under strain. And more recently or more latterly in South Africa, you're finding that there have been a number of developers that are looking at building plants in other parts of the country, so that they don't have the bottlenecks associated with not having access to the grid in a timely manner. The structure of the program in South Africa is such that you have 70% of the weighting from an evaluation perspective is actually based on tariff or price, and you have 30% that is attributed to other factors that the Department of Energy calls economic development criteria, ED factors. And by virtue of the ultimate scoring, your project is actually selected as a preferred bidder. The program specifically requires that projects are fully permitted and fully funded prior to being bid. So in that regard, in addition to the funding, you would need to have all your environmental consents, your land, your land issues sorted out. Either you're owning the land or you have a long-term notarial lease in place. You have your water licenses, and you have something that the ED criteria that I've alluded to talks about very specifically, is the indigenous people shareholding. So as we call it here in South Africa, the Black Economic Empowerment shareholding. So all of those requirements would typically need to be sorted out prior to you actually bidding your project, as these are sort of key issues that would be looked at from an evaluation perspective by the Department of Energy. South Africa does not have a guaranteed refit program. So essentially we have a model here which is very much an auction program. And as I've indicated, based on various factors, your project is actually selected as a preferred bidder with the ultimate weighting of 70% awarded to price, to tariff competitiveness, and 30% on the other factors that I've actually spoken about. South Africa has obviously got it's an emerging market, and our currency here, the South African Rand, is a pretty liquid currency. And whenever there is some contagion globally, you find that the Rand always takes a knock and devalues. And so the FX risk, the foreign exchange risk, is something that has been paramount on most developers' minds. And the way that is actually being tackled by the government or by the Department of Energy is that the South African government absorbs the foreign exchange movement between the bid date and financial close by announcing the applicable rate for at which your project could be pegged. And at financial close, the sponsors would then hedge. So essentially what happens is, as a sponsor, you would bid a particular project at a certain rate, and if you are then selected as a preferred bidder between that date and financial close, that if there's a movement in exchange rates, that risk is actually absorbed by the Department of Energy. And at financial close, the sponsors then would elect to hedge their projects for the construction period, at least when you have the largest exposure to, to the balance of plant and the EPC, which is often in US dollars or other hard currency. During that period, it would be hedged by the sponsors. So as I've indicated as well, we've had a phenomenal 5 rounds in South Africa of various projects, some 92 IPPs being allocated. And we've just had, through the ministerial determination, we've just had a further 6,300 megawatts being announced by the Department of Energy to be procured from Renewable Energy. So that basically has lent a lot of assurance to the development community that it is a sizable program and that renewable energy is here to stay in South Africa and will increasingly become a larger part of the generation mix in South Africa. According to a recent study that was done by the law firm Baker McKenzie, it was found that some 80% of renewable activity in sub-Saharan Africa will be in South Africa over the next 5 years. And clearly, if you look at what's happened over the last 4 years, it clearly lends credence to that. So I've got a couple other slides, essentially, on slide 6, bottom left corner, we talk about, I've spoken about the economic development criteria, and that is illustrated in greater depth, which you will no doubt be able to peruse in greater detail when you have access to the presentation. On slide 6, on the top right corner, is a breakdown of the number of megawatts that have been allocated across the various rounds in South Africa and across the various technologies. So that is something that you can actually peruse through on your own as well. What you have seen is what I've spoken about on the tariffs across the various technology. You've had a significant fall in tariffs, and certainly if you look at when the project program was launched in round 1, for wind, for example, we had a tariff of Rand 14 per kilowatt hour. And more laterally, on the last round, we've had something like 61 Rand cents per kilowatt hour. And similarly, if you look at solar PV as an example, you had a tariff, an average tariff that was allocated in round 1 of 2.74 Rand per kilowatt hour. And more laterally, it has been in the region of about 78 Rand cents per kilowatt hour. So very roughly, as a ballpark, if you divide by 10, you're looking at about 7 US cents per kilowatt hour solar PV more recently. And similarly, you've got that for CSP, for biomass, small hydro, etc. If I move on to slide 11, just paging through the presentation very quickly, slide 11 onwards gives you an illustration of the number of projects that we've had that have been awarded as preferred bidders in South Africa under the REIPP program. And there's a breakdown there for you across various technologies, so it's wind, PV, CSP, small hydro, landfill gas, biomass, etc. And that again is something you can look at on your own. And I think by virtue of the way the program has been structured, you've just had phenomenal interest from the global development community on renewable energy projects in South Africa. It's been well structured. It's culminated in a number of projects, having been allocated as preferred bidders here in South Africa over a very short period of time. And this is a big differentiator from, much of the rest of the region in sub-Saharan Africa, where generally to bed down projects, it takes a long time. And, and I think generally what you'll find elsewhere outside of South Africa, in Africa, is that generally there aren't too many countries that actually have a standardized program where you've got a bankable suite of documents, you've got, generally a credible off-taker, and, you haven't necessarily got any government support for the obligations of the off-taker. And as a result of all of the negotiations going back and forth, the lead times to close a typical project financing of magnitude in Africa is, in excess of 3 years from start to finish. Whereas you found that in South Africa, over a period of 4 years, we've had 92 IPPs, and at least 60 of them have already achieved financial close. So that is really, my story in a nutshell, and, very happy to field any questions or, take any concerns that you may have regarding the program, or if there's any further insight that you require, then I'm happy to field them. Thank you, Fernando.